In the quiet of the evening, as the world begins to soften into rest, there is a sacred space waiting for the heart to enter. A place where the soul may release the weight of the day and settle gently into the presence of peace. The story you are about to hear is more than words upon a page, more than an ancient memory. It is a timeless reminder of God's provision, of His abundance, of His care. Tonight, you are invited to walk along the shores of Galilee, to feel the breeze of the waters, to see the multitudes gather, and to witness the miracle of bread multiplied, not only for hungry bodies, but for weary souls like ours. Take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and imagine yourself resting in a quiet place by the sea. The air is cool and refreshing. The sun begins its slow descent beyond the horizon. The waves touch the shore with gentle rhythm. In this moment, you are safe. You are seen. You are held within the everlasting arms of the one who knows your every need. So much of life can feel like hunger. Hunger for answers. Hunger for strength. Hunger for peace. And sometimes, even hunger for hope itself. Yet tonight, let every longing be gathered here. Every silent prayer laid upon the open hands of God. For the one who called the world into being. The one who formed the mountains and carved the rivers. Is also the one who notices the smallest hunger, the faintest whisper, and the quiet sigh of the soul. This story begins not with fullness, but with emptiness. It begins with a people who follow Jesus through hills and valleys, who listen until their bodies grow weary, and who remain because their hearts cannot pull away from His words. And here you are, among them, sitting in the grass, hearing His voice carried on the evening wind. His words fall like dew upon the soul, refreshing, gentle, steady. Each sentence carries light. Each pause is filled with peace. And you find that your own heart, restless as it may have been, begins to soften, to breathe again. Tonight is a night to remember that God's abundance is not hurried, nor is it limited. His gifts flow gently, like water from a spring that never runs dry. You do not need to strive to earn them, nor do you need to fear that they will vanish. For in the kingdom of God, there is always enough. So let the worries of tomorrow slip away for now. Let the anxieties of the day loosen their grip. You are not alone. You are part of the multitude gathered. You are one among thousands who have come with open hearts. And Jesus, seeing the crowd, sees you, not as one hidden among many, but as one deeply known. Can you imagine His gaze? gentle yet strong, filled with compassion that pierces through every defense. His eyes carry no condemnation, only understanding, only love. And in that love, there is rest. The story of the feeding of the 5,000 is not only about bread. It is about the bread of life himself. For in his presence, scarcity turns to abundance, and emptiness becomes fullness. What seems small and insignificant is transformed into something more than enough. And as this story begins to unfold tonight, you are invited to let it speak to you in the hidden places of your soul, the places where you may feel lacking, the corners of your life where you wonder if there will ever be enough. Enough peace, enough strength, enough love. Tonight, the answer comes gently but surely. Yes, there will be enough, because he is enough. Let your breathing slow. In and out, in and out, like the tide upon the shore. As you listen, may each word rest upon your heart like a soft covering, bringing warmth, bringing comfort, bringing quiet assurance that you are not forgotten. You are seen. You are beloved. And so, we begin this journey together, not in haste, but in gentle rhythm, step by step, thought by thought, following the path of the crowd as they seek the presence of Jesus. Following them, we too shall find that in him there is more than we could ever imagine. Close your eyes if you wish. Release the burdens you have carried all day, and prepare your heart to rest in the abundance of God's love. For this story is not only theirs, it is also yours. The Sea of Galilee stretched wide before the people, a body of water both familiar and mysterious. Its waves carried stories of fishermen who made their living there, of storms that rose suddenly and fiercely, and of quiet mornings when the surface lay still like glass, reflecting the heavens above. On this particular day, the sea glistened beneath the afternoon sun. Soft winds brushed across its surface, and the air carried the mingling scents of salt and earth. Villages nearby had emptied as families, neighbors, and travelers made their way to the hillside, following the sound of Jesus' teaching. Picture the slope of the land, a gentle rise that offered a view of both water and sky. Children tugged at their mothers' garments, eager to run ahead. Fathers guided their families, steadying them along the paths. Elders leaned on their staffs, each step deliberate, but their hearts lightened by anticipation. Thousands were gathering, drawn not by spectacle, but by the simple hope that his words might fill them in ways nothing else could. The grass was soft beneath their feet, green and welcoming, a natural cushion upon which to sit. The hillside stretched like an open invitation, vast enough to hold every soul who came. Some sat close to the front, eyes fixed upon him, eager not to miss a single word. Others rested further back, content to listen as his voice carried gently on the breeze. Wherever they sat, there was room. For here, in this place, no one was turned away. The lake itself glimmered like a jewel in the sunlight. Ripples danced upon its surface as birds dipped low to skim the water. Fishermen's boats could be seen in the distance, their sails white against the blue expanse. The hum of life was all around. Yet the greatest stillness was found in the presence of Jesus. He spoke, not in the tones of power the world often demands, but in the language of truth and tenderness. His words fell as naturally as rain upon thirsty ground. The crowd leaned in, hearts awakened, for in his voice was something more than knowledge. It was life itself. Imagine the setting as evening began to unfold. The shadows stretched longer. The air cooled with a refreshing calm. A soft golden light washed over the hillside, touching every face with warmth. The scene held the beauty of creation at rest, as if even the earth itself paused to listen. It was not just the physical place that mattered, but the way it seemed to hold heaven and earth together. The sea with its unending horizon spoke of mystery. The hillside with its open space spoke of welcome. And the presence of Christ spoke of eternity. As you rest within this image tonight, imagine yourself among the multitude, finding a spot in the grass, your body relaxing into the earth, your mind quieting as you lift your eyes toward him. There is no rush, no demands pressing upon you here, only the steady rhythm of his words, carrying peace deeper into your soul. Think of how the disciples must have felt, moving among the people, watching the growing crowd with awe. Their teacher's influence was spreading, his words reaching further than they had ever imagined. Yet even in their amazement, they did not yet know what the evening would bring. That upon this hillside, a miracle would unfold that would be remembered for generations. The setting by the sea was not accidental. It was chosen by God, a canvas upon which abundance would be painted. The sea symbolized vastness, a reminder that his mercy has no end. The hillside symbolized openness, a place where all could gather without walls or barriers. And the people themselves symbolized humanity, hungry, searching, longing for something more. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Jesus, the one who saw every need, every longing, every unspoken prayer. He stood not only as a teacher, but as the very provision of God Himself. As the waves continued their soft rhythm, the scene prepared for what was to come. A moment when heaven's abundance would meet earth's hunger, and the miracle would whisper into every heart. With God, there is always enough. Oi! Let this setting settle into your spirit tonight. Let the sea remind you of God's endless grace. Let the hillside remind you of His welcome. Let the gathering remind you that you are not alone in your search for peace. And above all, let the presence of Jesus remind you that wherever you are, whatever you carry, He is near. So rest, breathe, and picture yourself there still. The setting sun painting the sky, the cool air calming your body, the sea before you, and the Savior within sight. This is where the story lives. This is where abundance begins. The people kept coming, step after step, their feet stirring the dust of the roads that led toward the hillside. Some came quickly, hearts eager to be near Jesus, while others walked slowly, burdened by weariness yet unwilling to turn back. Word had spread that He was teaching by the sea, and so men and women brought their families. Neighbors called out to neighbors, and soon the fields and paths were alive with movement. Mothers carried little ones against their shoulders, gently rocking them as they walked. Older children skipped ahead, their laughter mingling with the murmur of the crowd. The sick leaned upon loved ones for support, their eyes filled with hope that perhaps today would be the day their suffering lifted. Farmers left their tools behind. Fishermen stepped away from their boats. Merchants paused from their trade. For in the presence of this teacher, everything else could wait. The hillside began to swell with people. Thousands upon thousands, their garments bright against the green grass. The sound of many voices blending together like a soft river of life. Yet in the midst of such a great multitude, there was no chaos, only a kind of reverent expectancy, as if every soul there knew that something beyond themselves was about to unfold. Those who had already arrived sat in the grass, forming small circles of families and friends. Some shaded their faces from the sun with pieces of cloth, while others simply gazed upward, shielding their eyes with the curve of their hands. All leaned forward, listening, hearts intent upon catching every word that passed from His lips. And there was Jesus, calm, steady, His voice carrying easily across the slope. Each word seemed to settle deep within those who heard, like seed falling upon fertile ground. He spoke not as the leaders of the law spoke, not with burdensome rules or distant proclamations, but with authority that was gentle, filled with compassion, filled with truth. The people hung upon his every word, for in him they found a hope they had never known before. It was as though the gathering itself was a living parable. So many different lives converging in one place. The wealthy seated beside the poor, the strong beside the weak, the joyful beside the grieving. All differences blurred in the presence of Christ. Every heart equal in its hunger, every soul united in its longing. The disciples moved among the people, watching with both awe and unease. They saw the sheer size of the multitude and marveled at the reach of their teacher's voice. Yet with each new group that arrived, a quiet question began to stir in their thoughts. How would this end? How would so many be cared for? Still, they remained silent, choosing to trust for the moment. As the hours passed, the crowd grew still more. The hillside blanketed with men and women, children and elders, until the sight itself was overwhelming. To any other eye it might have seemed impossible. Too many, too much. But to the one who stood before them, every face was known, every heart counted. And so they gathered, drawn by a longing they could not fully name, drawn by a voice that spoke to the deepest places within them. They were not merely an audience. They were souls on the edge of receiving. The sun lowered little by little. Shadows lengthened across the grass. Yet no one wished to leave. The day stretched long, but time seemed to vanish in his presence. The crowd waited, hungry for more than bread, hungry for the words of eternal life. Jesus looked upon the vast sea of people spread across the hillside, and in his gaze there was no impatience, no irritation at their endless needs, only compassion as deep as the waters that shimmered behind him. He saw the mothers holding tired children. He saw the fathers with furrowed brows, wondering how long the day would last. He saw the weary who had come hoping for healing. And he saw the hopeful whose hearts leaned forward toward every word. His compassion was not the fleeting kindness of a moment. It was the steady love of one who knew each life intimately, who understood every hidden burden, every silent ache. In the multitude, others might have seen only numbers, but he saw faces, and in each face he saw a story, a longing, a hunger deeper than food could ever fill. As he spoke, his words wove through the air like a gentle melody, binding them together, giving rest where there was restlessness, courage where there was fear, light where there had been only shadows. The children sat quietly, almost without realizing why. The restless hearts of men softened. The quiet tears of women glistened unseen. For in his presence, compassion was not merely spoken. It was felt. It was given like breath itself. He healed those who were sick, not rushing through their pain, but pausing, touching, restoring. Every act of kindness was deliberate, not hurried or small, but full, complete. He gave as though his very being was an endless well of mercy. And the people received, their wonder growing, their hope stretching higher with each moment. The disciples watched, sometimes with awe, sometimes with uncertainty, for the crowd was so great and the day was growing late. Yet even as their practical thoughts wrestled with reality, Jesus remained unshaken, his compassion never dimming, his love never thinning in the face of need. The air grew cooler as the sun moved lower in the sky. Still the people lingered, for his words were life to them. They had forgotten their hunger for bread, because they were being fed with something greater, a nourishment that reached the soul. But Jesus, who knew the needs of the body as well as the spirit, was aware that their hunger would soon press in upon them. He knew the weakness that could follow after such a long day. He knew that even as their souls were filled, their bodies would still cry out for sustenance. And so his compassion stirred not only for their hearts, but for their flesh. His mercy was whole, not divided. It cared for the spirit, and it cared for the body. For in the kingdom of God, both are seen, both are loved. In that compassion there was a glimpse of the Father's heart, a heart that notices the smallest sparrow, a heart that knows when a single hair falls from one's head, a heart that does not turn away from need, but bends down to meet it, to embrace it, to lift it into abundance. The crowd could not yet see what was coming. They did not know that in their hunger, they would be given a miracle. They only knew that to remain near him was to feel safe, to feel held, to feel at peace. And so they stayed, drawn ever deeper into the compassion of Christ. The evening pressed closer, the first stars hinting at their rise. And still he looked upon them, not weary of their presence, not burdened by their number, but moved with love that no multitude could exhaust. Compassion like the sea behind him, wide, endless, and full. The day stretched on, the hours unfolding like pages in a story that no one wanted to end. The people sat upon the hillside, listening, leaning in closer with each word that passed from his lips. Time slipped away unnoticed, for in his teaching there was no heaviness, only light that lifted their hearts higher than the sun above them. The voices of children, which might have filled the air in play, grew soft and hushed, as if they too were caught by the mystery of his presence. The restless shifting of weary bodies slowed. For even the ache of sitting long upon the grass seemed lighter when his words were near. He spoke of the kingdom of God, of a kingdom where the lowly were lifted, where the poor were rich in faith, where the mourning were comforted, where the meek would inherit the earth. Each word fell gently, like rain upon thirsty ground, and the souls of the people drank deeply. Some had traveled far, leaving behind their work, their homes, even their meals. Yet none regretted the journey, for what they received in his presence could not be measured in coins or counted in loaves. They were hearing truth that touched the marrow of their being, truth that could not be silenced by time. And so they stayed, hour after hour, their hearts so full that their bodies' needs slipped quietly to the edges of awareness. The sun rose high, then bent low. Shadows lengthened, painting the hillside in hues of gold. But still they remained. The disciples moved quietly among the multitude, watching faces filled with awe, listening to the murmurs of wonder, feeling both the joy of what they witnessed and the weight of what loomed ahead. For as the day waned, their own thoughts began to turn to food, to the simple realities of hunger that would soon demand an answer. Yet even so, they did not interrupt him. They waited, uncertain of what would come. The crowd itself seemed unaware of time's passage. They leaned on one another, some resting their heads upon a friend's shoulder, some clasping the hands of loved ones. But none wished to leave, for the words of life were pouring out before them, and they feared to miss even a single syllable. Imagine the atmosphere. Thousands of hearts beating in unison, thousands of ears bent toward his voice. It was as though heaven itself had bent low to the earth, as though eternity had touched a single moment, and all who were present felt it, whether they could name it or not. The long day became a tapestry woven of silence and speech, of teaching and listening, of heaven meeting earth. And though their stomachs grew empty, their souls were filled. A paradox of plenty in the midst of nothing. The golden light of evening spread slowly across the sea. And still he spoke, his compassion undiminished, his voice steady and sure, his love unmeasured by the passing of time. And the people, thousands upon thousands, clung to his presence, letting go of all else. For in him they had found what they had been searching for all their lives. As the sun slid lower across the horizon, a hush began to stir among the multitude. Not the silence of wonder this time, but the faint, growing quiet of weariness, of bodies that had lingered long in one place, of stomachs that had been empty since the morning. The children shifted against their mothers, small hands tugging for comfort. The elders leaned heavier upon their staffs. The men and women who had come so eagerly now began to feel the pull of their hunger. The hillside, so alive with voices only hours before, now carried a softer tone. A murmur that rose and fell like the low hum of the sea behind them. Hunger is patient at first. But when the day grows long, it speaks louder. It makes itself known in the hollow ache beneath the ribs, in the weariness that creeps through the limbs, in the heaviness of the eyes. Yet none wished to leave, for his presence was greater than the pangs within them. Their bodies cried out for bread, but their souls clung to his words. And still, the need pressed closer, unrelenting. The disciples felt it most keenly. They moved through the crowd and saw the faces. They saw the children's tired eyes, the parents' worry, the elders' frailty. They knew the people would soon need to eat. And they themselves, though more accustomed to long days of travel, felt the weight of hunger in their own bodies. They exchanged glances with one another, uncertain of what to do, for they knew there was nothing in their hands. No market nearby, no village close enough to provide for such a number. Evening air grew cooler, brushing across the hillside with a hint of night's approach. The shadows stretched longer, the golden glow fading into softer tones of rose and purple. Time was slipping away, and with it came the urgency of need. Hunger, left unanswered, can sow restlessness. Yet here it was met with patience. For still the people did not rise to leave. Still they sat. Still they listened. Their trust in him greater than their own discomfort. They lingered in hope that somehow, some way, he would not let them go empty. And Jesus, though he had spoken long and given much, was not blind to their need. His eyes swept across the crowd, and he saw what was stirring. He knew the ache in their bodies. He knew the frailty of their frame. He knew that as surely as they had hungered for his words, they also hungered for bread. In that moment, heaven and earth seemed to meet in the simplest of human realities. The need for food, the hunger that all share. For God, who had once sent manna to his people in the wilderness, was now present among them in the flesh, and he would not let their hunger go unanswered. Yet still, the disciples did not understand what was to come. They whispered among themselves, "What could be done? How could so many be fed?" Their minds reached for solutions but found none. Their hands grasped at the size of the need and felt only emptiness. The crowd, though weary, waited quietly. It was as if the earth itself held its breath. The sea behind them lapped gently upon the shore. The air grew still. The light softened into the tender hues of evening, and the hunger of thousands pressed close. But within that hunger lay the opening for a miracle. For hunger is not only emptiness. It is invitation. It is the place where God's provision enters, where His abundance meets our lack, where His love reveals itself most tenderly. The multitude did not yet know, but their hunger was about to be met, not only with bread, but with a revelation of the one who is the true bread of life. And so the scene was set. The hillside filled with need, the crowd filled with longing, the disciples filled with questions, and Jesus filled with compassion. The hunger deepened, the evening pressed in, and heaven prepared to pour abundance upon the earth. They moved together through the thinning light, the small band of disciples threading the gentle slope like caretakers among a field of lanterns about to go dim. Each familiar face in that circle carried the same shadowed thought. The day had poured itself out like water, and the people still sat, listening, hoping, hungering. Practical minds awakened first, counting without coins, measuring without baskets. One looked toward the shoreline, as if a flotilla of vendors might suddenly appear with bread enough for a town. Another scanned the ridges above the lake, imagining distant villages with ovens cooling after the day's last loaves had been drawn out. The mind does what it knows when need stands tall. It counts. It calculates. It concludes. They paused near families where little ones had grown heavy with drowsiness, where elders held steady breaths to quiet the ache of emptiness. They saw hands clasped in patient waiting, heard low murmurs of reassurance, noticed how hunger made even kindness quieter. The disciples felt the tug of responsibility, not only as followers of their teacher, but as men who cared for crowds they had not invited and yet felt called to shepherd for a moment in time. A few of them drew closer to one another, shoulders nearly touching, speaking in soft fragments that blended into the evening breeze. They weighed the distance to the nearest market town, the number of bakers a town that size could hold, the hour that had already leaned beyond the day's commerce. Even if ovens were relit, even if fields of grain stood waiting just beyond the next hill, how could supply be gathered, transported, divided, without turning the order of trust into the confusion of scarcity? One remembered the purse they carried for common needs, and the memory brought a hollow smile. The purse was serviceable for a handful, not for a sea of souls ribboned across the grass like a second shoreline. Another remembered journeys when they themselves had gone hungry and discovered a surprising strength in doing without. But this was different. This was not a lesson for a few companions on the road. This was an assembly of thousands. Children with soft breathing and empty stomachs. Mothers with quiet eyes. Fathers with steady concern. They looked toward Jesus where he stood calm within the gentle hush he himself had created. His presence held the crowd as a shoreline holds the sea. Yet the disciples' thoughts moved as tides do beneath a still surface, restlessly seeking an answer that did not appear. They loved him, trusted him, followed him, and yet their human care demanded action. At last they approached, careful not to trouble the people who had come so far. They stood within the reach of his peace and felt their calculations slow. The urgency did not vanish, but it softened. In his nearness, even practicality learned to breathe. Still, the need remained, and as stewards of what they could see, they offered the only counsel their hands could hold. They asked that the multitude be released while the light lingered, that families could make for the hamlets tucked in the folds of the hills, that shops might yet be open, that ovens might still be warm. They spoke for the children whose heads had drifted to sleep on a parent's lap, for those who had come far without a bundle of provisions, for those whose strength would fade if night met them on the road. Their words were not complaint, but care. The sturdy kindness of people who have learned the hard mathematics of the world and attempt to spare others its edges. Beneath their request lay honest fatigue. They had walked many miles, carried many tasks, watched many healings. They too felt the hollowness that follows long hours without bread. Their concern for the crowd was also the concern of tired shepherds for the flock and for themselves. Humility colored the thought. They were not enough for this. Their arms could not stretch wide enough. Their pockets could not weigh heavy enough. Their ideas could not run fast enough to outrun the sun sliding toward the far ridge. Around them the hillside breathed in slow, shared patience. A toddler murmured and settled. Someone stifled a cough and then another. A breeze lifted strands of hair and cooled foreheads warmed by the day. The sea kept its kindly rhythm as though reciting a psalm in the language of water. The world itself seemed to hold the ache without tipping into fear. And yet the ache was there. One of the disciples let his eyes travel across the wide gathering and felt a pinch of grief that care could be so large. He remembered smaller meals shared on earlier days. Simple bread broken among a few companions. The ease of dividing a little when the number was small. He wondered at the path that had brought them to this immense meadow of need, and whether tomorrow would remember this evening as only a lesson in letting go, or as something more. Another thought of the wilderness stories learned in childhood, of manna that met people at dawn like a mercy that refused to be withheld. He wondered if such things belonged only to far-off pages, if they lived anywhere beyond memory. And he did not yet dare to wonder whether memory itself stood living among them. They watched Jesus' face as they presented their counsel, and found in it no trace of rebuke for their sensible hearts. Only the steady attention of one who hears not merely the words of a request but the weight beneath it. He understood the arithmetic of scarcity better than any of them. And yet he belonged to a reality where sums did not end at zero, where the Father's heart could not be reduced to a ledger. The disciples waited in that gentle tension. Practicality leaning forward. Faith holding its breath. Their proposal was reasonable. Merciful even. Let them go now while there is light. Let them find what the countryside can offer. Let each return with enough for the night. They pictured the hillside emptying in small streams of people flowing toward the lanes and paths. They imagined the quiet afterward and the soft relief that follows a difficult decision made. But somewhere just beyond the edge of their imagining, another possibility rested. Still and luminous as the first star before dusk. They felt it the way one feels a change in the wind before seeing the ripple on the sea. A not yet kind of knowing. Tender. Almost shy. Waiting to be welcomed rather than forced. They glanced at the small cluster of belongings they carried. A few items for the road. Nothing that would alter the hunger of thousands. They glanced at the crowd and then back to him, and sensed that their concern had brought them to the threshold of something they could not design. Their counsel had reached its faithful limit, and now another way would need to open. Around them, conversations dwindled to murmurs, then to the soft quiet of expectation. The hour stood between daylight and dusk like a door half open. The hillside smelled of grass and lake and evening. Torches had not yet been lit. Birds had not yet gone fully still. Children were not yet fully asleep. Everything felt like a held breath. The disciples' hearts moved through a last turning of human logic, considering once more the purse, the distance, the time. Then, as if agreeing together without speech, they let the calculations rest in his presence. They had brought what care could bring. They had asked what shepherds should ask. Now they would listen as followers must listen when a path appears where earth had shown only a wall. In that listening they found themselves quieter than before, as though their very concern had been received and gentled. Their shoulders eased, not because the need had lessened, but because the need had been lifted into hands they trusted more than their own. The hillside waited with them. The water kept time, and the sky deepened its blue as if it too leaned nearer to hear. The disciples did not know that the next steps would carve a memory into the heart of the world. They only knew that they had come to the end of themselves without shame, that they had offered prudent kindness without stubbornness, that they now stood ready for whatever mercy would ask of them. Whether it was to guide the people down the paths toward villages, or to carry bread they could not explain from basket to basket until every open hand had closed upon enough. For the moment, concern had done its holy work. It had seen. It had spoken. It had yielded. And in the tender silence that followed, the evening waited for faith to be invited from the margins into the center. Like a lamp carried into a room at the hour when shadows lengthen and the heart longs for light, the crowd breathed as one great body. the disciples as one small circle within it, and Jesus as the still point around which both hunger and hope would soon turn. The sea moved. The grasses brushed against ankles and sandals. The first star dared its pale arrival above the slope. And the world poised itself for an answer that would not begin with what was in human hands, but with what rested in the heart of God. Jesus listened, his eyes moving over the circle of disciples, hearing every layer beneath their words. He knew their concern was real, and he honored it. Yet his answer did not follow the lines of their reasoning. It stretched far beyond, opening a doorway into the mystery of heaven's provision. He spoke quietly, yet his words carried weight enough to still the air around them. Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Oi! A question so simple, yet so impossible. It lingered like a stone dropped into deep water, ripples moving outward through their minds and hearts. The disciples looked at one another, startled, uncertain whether they had heard him rightly. The hillside seemed to lean closer in that moment. The crowd hushed by distance, yet not beyond the reach of his presence. Philip, always one to calculate, found the question striking the part of him that counted first and trusted later. He thought of silver coins, of wages earned day after day, and of the staggering sum that even a small meal for so many would require. 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. His words bore the sound of honest reality, the kind of truth measured by numbers and weighed upon scales. And yet, behind Jesus' eyes, another truth glowed. A truth that could not be captured in ledgers or balanced in columns. His question was not born of ignorance, but of invitation. An invitation to look beyond scarcity, beyond human arithmetic, into the heart of a Father whose resources have no end. Andrew, standing nearby, shifted his gaze toward the crowd. His eyes caught upon a boy seated with his family. A boy whose small satchel carried what seemed like nothing in the face of such a multitude. 5 loaves of barley bread, 2 small fish. Andrew's words came almost reluctantly, as though he already knew the futility of naming so little. Here is a boy with 5 small loaves and 2 fish. But how far will they go among so many? Oi! The disciples' voices echoed the tension between faith and practicality. One speaking of wages impossible, the other pointing to a gift too small. Both were true in the language of earth. Both revealed the limits of human sight. Yet neither grasped what heaven was preparing to reveal. Jesus received their words without rebuke, without haste. He let the weight of the moment settle, the hunger of thousands pressing near, the emptiness of their own resources laid bare. For only when the insufficiency was clear could the abundance of God shine unclouded. The boy's offering seemed laughable to some. Barley bread was the food of the poor. The fish were small and ordinary. Yet in the eyes of Jesus, this was not poverty. It was possibility. The smallness itself was the canvas upon which divine provision would be painted. His disciples stood with furrowed brows, hearts still bound to what they could see and measure. They wrestled with the impossibility. Their concern was real. Their reasoning was sound. Yet the one before them was not bound by soundness or sums. He was bound only by love. A love that delights in taking what is small and making it enough. The evening deepened as he let silence rest over them. The crowd stirred faintly. The sound of shifting bodies upon the grass. A cough here. A murmur there. The faint cry of a child. All of it underscoring the urgency of the question he had posed. Where shall we buy bread? Oi! It had no answer in their world. And yet it was the very question that would open the door to another. The disciples did not yet understand. But in their confusion, something holy was unfolding. Their helplessness was the soil in which faith could grow. Their lack was the altar upon which abundance would soon be laid. The boy's small satchel, unnoticed by nearly everyone, became the quiet hinge of history that night. What was little in the eyes of man was seen fully in the eyes of God. Jesus did not rush. He did not answer as the world would answer. He let the question hang like a star against the deepening sky. He let their thoughts run to their limits. He let their solutions end in silence, until all that remained was what he already knew, that the Father's provision would be enough. And so the evening stood still, disciples unsettled by the weight of impossibility. A boy clutching loaves and fish without yet knowing what part he played. And Jesus calm in the certainty of a kingdom that does not measure by scarcity, but by love that multiplies without end. The boy's hands were small, his satchel smaller still. Yet within it lay the simple food his mother had packed that morning. 5 coarse loaves of barley bread, 2 small fish, dried and salted. Humble provisions, ordinary and unremarkable. Yet in this moment, carried across the hillside through Andrew's uncertain words, it became the offering that would touch eternity. The disciples looked at the satchel with doubt, their weary eyes tracing its small weight against the immensity of the crowd. What was this among so many? How could such little feed such vastness? Their thoughts still turned in the patterns of earth, where little is always little, where lack is always lack, where the end is always the end. But Jesus looked differently. His gaze lingered not upon the size of the gift but upon the heart that offered it. For in the kingdom of heaven, greatness is not measured by quantity, but by willingness, by trust, by the surrender of what is held. The boy had not clung to his food. though hunger pressed upon the multitude. He had not hidden it away in fear of losing the only sustenance he had. Instead, when asked, he released it. Small though it was, he gave what was in his hands, without knowing what would be done with it, without grasping for control. His act was as pure as the bread itself. Simple, unadorned, enough for a miracle to take root. The disciples, still caught between skepticism and obedience, carried the small bundle to Jesus. It must have felt almost embarrassing to lay such little before such great need, to present such poverty in the face of thousands waiting. Yet they did it. They placed the loaves and fish in his hands. And there, in that transfer, the miracle began. For what is placed in the hands of Christ is never small again. Imagine the scene. The sun dipping low upon the sea. The cool air brushing across the hillside. Thousands waiting in patience and hunger. Disciples watching with uncertain hearts. And in the midst of it all, Jesus taking into his hands the meager food of a boy. The crowd did not yet know what was happening. But heaven leaned close. For surrender had been made. Trust had been given. And love was about to multiply what no arithmetic could explain. The boy's gift became more than bread and fish that night. It became a testimony, a witness of what God can do with what is yielded to him. It was not the abundance of the offering that mattered, but the abundance of the one who received it. As Jesus held the loaves and fish, time seemed to pause. The disciples saw it. The crowd awaited it. The sea whispered it. Everything leaned toward this moment, when the littlest gift would become the vessel of heaven's abundance. And though no one yet knew how, all could sense it. The hunger pressing like weight across the multitude was about to meet the love that never ends. Jesus received the small bundle. His hands steady. His face calm. The rough loaves of barley bread rested in his palms. The two simple fish laid across them. Nothing remarkable in their form. Nothing that suggested they could fill the emptiness of even one family, let alone thousands. Yet in his hands, the ordinary no longer remained ordinary. The disciples watched, still caught in the tension between doubt and hope. They knew the weight of hunger that pressed upon the multitude. They knew the weakness of their own resources. They knew the smallness of what lay before him. And yet, as he held the loaves, something stirred deep within. A quiet sense that they stood at the edge of mystery, as though the earth itself leaned forward to see what heaven would do. Jesus did not hesitate. He did not measure the food against the crowd. He did not shake his head at the insufficiency. He simply received it, with the same peace he had shown when speaking to the storm. with the same assurance he carried when touching the blind and the lame. For he knew that when something is surrendered into the Father's hands, it ceases to be measured by lack. The boy's offering, so small in human sight, was lifted into divine purpose. The very act of placing it into his hands was the turning point. The disciples may not yet have understood, but heaven knew. The kingdom was moving through bread and fish, through trust and surrender, through the hands of the Son who delighted in doing the will of his Father. Around them the crowd waited, their murmurs quieting, their restlessness stilled by the gentleness of his presence. They did not know what was about to happen, but they knew that this man, unlike any other they had ever known, did not overlook their need. He saw them. He felt their hunger. He understood the ache in their bodies, just as he had understood the ache in their hearts. He looked upward, his gaze lifting beyond the crowd, beyond the sea, beyond the fading light of evening. His eyes fixed upon the heavens, not in desperation, but in communion, in love, in trust. For every gift returned to the Father is met with blessing. The disciples felt the hush deepen, as though the world itself grew still. The sea's rhythm softened. The evening birds quieted. Even the children hushed upon their mothers' laps. All eyes turned toward him, bread and fish in his hands, his face raised toward heaven. What the disciples had brought in doubt, what the boy had given in trust, was now lifted beyond both, to the one from whom every good and perfect gift comes. The moment was simple, yet sacred. An offering, too small for earth, but more than enough for heaven. And in that lifting, in that quiet surrender, the miracle was already present. For when Jesus holds what we give, it no longer remains what it was. It becomes what it was always meant to be. The crowd did not yet see bread multiplied. The disciples did not yet carry baskets overflowing. But in his hands, the promise of abundance had already been secured. The evening air pressed gently around them. The first stars peeked from the deepening sky. The sea reflected the fading gold of the sun. And in the midst of it all, the hands of Jesus held bread and fish, lifted toward heaven, about to break the boundary between scarcity and abundance. Jesus held the loaves and the fish high enough for all to see. And then his voice rose into the evening air. Not loud, not strained, but steady and reverent. He gave thanks, his words flowing upward toward the Father. Words born not of doubt but of certainty, not of fear but of trust. He thanked the giver before the gift had multiplied. He blessed the bread before it had broken into countless pieces. He praised the Father before the miracle unfolded. For in his heart there was no question of scarcity. Only the assurance that the Father's love is abundance without end. The disciples stood close, watching as his lips formed the prayer. They heard gratitude where their minds still carried calculation. They heard blessing where their eyes still saw only lack. It was as if his words pulled their hearts away from the numbers they had been counting, and lifted them into the reality of heaven. The crowd hushed, thousands leaning forward into the quiet of his blessing. The sound of the sea faded into the background. The wind seemed to pause. Even creation itself stilled as the Son communed with the Father, giving thanks for what was small, trusting it to become more than enough. In that prayer, bread became more than bread. Fish became more than fish. They became the vessels of God's goodness, tangible expressions of His mercy, signs that the Father delights to provide for His children. Jesus lowered His gaze again, His eyes filled with calm assurance. And then, with deliberate gentleness, He broke the bread. The crack of the loaf sounded small at first, but in the silence it echoed, sharp and clear, like the opening note of a great symphony. The disciples looked at the pieces in His hands, fragments that should have lessened the supply. Yet even in their breaking, something mysterious was already at work. For the pieces did not diminish. They seemed to remain whole. His hands never empty. His fingers never without bread to give. He placed the first portion into the hands of a disciple. Then another. And another. Each time his hands opened, bread remained. Each time his hands stretched outward, the gift renewed itself. There was no strain in his movement, no effort as though he labored to create. It simply flowed, as naturally as water from a spring. The fish too were divided, passed from his hands into the waiting hands of his followers. And still there was more. The more he gave, the more there was to give. No one could explain it. No one could trace its logic. It defied the arithmetic of earth. Yet it followed perfectly the generosity of heaven. The disciples' eyes widened as they carried the first baskets toward the crowd. And when they returned, his hands were still full. Again they carried food into the multitude. Again they returned. And still he gave. The people marveled, hands outstretched to receive, mouths opening in astonishment as bread passed from neighbor to neighbor. Children laughed as food filled their laps. Elders lifted their eyes skyward in wonder. Families ate together in joy. The hunger that had pressed so heavily only moments before was melting into delight. But even as the crowd began to taste the miracle, Jesus remained serene, his focus never shifting, his communion with the Father unbroken. Every motion of his hands was blessing made visible. Every act of giving was thanksgiving extended outward. What had begun with gratitude was now flowing into abundance. The breaking of bread was not loss. It was multiplication. The dividing of fish was not reduction. It was increase. In the hands of Jesus, what was small became endless. What was ordinary became extraordinary. What was limited became infinite. The hillside was alive now with joy, with laughter, with the sound of bread being torn and shared. The fragrance of fish carried on the breeze. The people ate freely, as much as they wanted. Their hunger met. Their hearts lifted. And still, the hands of Jesus did not empty. The miracle moved outward like ripples across still water, beginning in the hands of Jesus, passing into the hands of the disciples, flowing from basket to basket, and spreading through the multitude until the hillside itself seemed to breathe with abundance. Each disciple carried bread and fish into the crowd, expecting perhaps that this trip would be their last, that soon the supply would vanish, that their hands would return empty. Yet each time they turned back, his hands were full again, waiting with more to give, more to share, more to place into their keeping. They began to realize this was no fleeting trick, no momentary abundance that would soon collapse back into lack. This was a stream without end, a river of provision flowing steadily from his hands. Each loaf broken created more loaves. Each fish divided yielded more fish. Nothing diminished. Nothing ran out. The people looked upon what they were given. Bread coarse yet satisfying. Fish seasoned by the sea. Food both simple and miraculous. They tore pieces and passed them to their children. They lifted portions to their lips in wonder. They shared with neighbors beside them, laughter rising as hunger gave way to delight. Children who had grown restless now laughed with crumbs at the corners of their mouths. Elders who had sunk into weary silence now lifted their heads, chewing slowly, eyes wet with gratitude. Mothers smiled as little ones ate until full. Fathers watched in astonishment as their families received more than they could have hoped for. The hillside was alive with the sound of eating, of joy, of voices marveling at what they held in their hands. Families who had carried nothing found their laps full. Those who had expected to leave hungry found themselves satisfied. The need that had pressed so heavily against them only moments before had been replaced by peace. The disciples themselves felt their doubt turn to awe. With each journey from his hands to the crowd, their hearts shifted. Their weariness lightened. Their faith strengthened. They had expected impossibility. but they were witnessing eternity unfold before their eyes. They had once asked, "How far will this go among so many?" Now they knew the answer. In his hands, it went as far as it needed. And still, the supply did not cease. Still the baskets filled. Still the food flowed outward. The multitude had no sense of scarcity. Each ate as much as he desired. Each child filled her stomach until laughter overcame her hunger. Each elder ate until strength returned to his limbs. There was no rationing, no portioning into tiny fragments. There was only abundance. It was a feast, not of fine delicacies, but of heaven's generosity poured into earth's simplicity. The taste of bread and fish was more than sustenance. It was the flavor of God's mercy, the texture of his kindness, the evidence of his love made visible. As the disciples carried the baskets, they felt themselves drawn deeper into the mystery. It was not only the crowd who were fed. They themselves were being nourished in spirit. Their doubt broken as surely as the bread was broken. Their fear divided as surely as the fish were divided. Their faith multiplied as surely as the food multiplied. The people no longer sat in quiet hunger. They ate freely. They spoke in joy. They marveled together. The hillside became a table. The crowd became a family. And Christ became the host who satisfied every soul. And still, his hands did not empty. His face serene. His gaze tender. His presence steady. He gave and gave and gave. Without measure. Without limit. Without end. The sea glimmered in the background. The stars lifted higher into the deepening sky. And on the hillside thousands were fed. Body and soul alike. Each one with enough. Each one with more than enough. The hillside grew quiet again. But this time it was not the silence of waiting. It was the deep stillness that follows satisfaction. A holy calm settled upon the multitude. Not the heaviness of hunger, but the peace of fullness. Thousands who had arrived weary and empty were now leaning back against the grass, hands resting loosely upon their laps. The ache within them stilled. Children curled against their mothers, their small bellies round with food, drifting into sleep with crumbs still at the corners of their mouths. Elders, once faint and weary, sat upright with renewed strength, their faces softened by relief. Fathers watched their families with eyes bright from wonder. Mothers exchanged smiles of quiet gratitude. It was not only the body that was filled. It was the soul. The bread and fish satisfied their hunger. But the miracle itself satisfied something deeper. Something words could scarcely name. For each bite carried more than flavor. It carried the assurance that God sees, that He knows, that He provides. The disciples moved among them still, their baskets lighter now, but their hearts heavy with awe. They saw the joy upon the people's faces, heard the laughter, witnessed the relief, and they knew they had taken part in something beyond themselves. They had doubted, they had reasoned, they had feared the emptiness, yet they had also carried the abundance from His hands into the world. Jesus stood quietly at the center of it all, His presence calm, His gaze resting upon the crowd with tenderness. He did not need to raise His voice. He did not need to draw attention to Himself. The miracle itself spoke louder than words. And yet, He remained near, not distant from their joy, but present within it. The sea, touched by the last light of day, shimmered with a gentle glow. Stars awakened one by one in the darkening sky, and the hillside became a place of holy memory, a place where hunger met mercy, where scarcity bowed before abundance, where the simple became sacred in His hands. The people looked around them and saw not only their families filled, but their neighbors as well. No one was left out. No one was forgotten. Every hand that had reached forward had received. Every stomach that had ached was now quieted. Every soul that had longed was met with the kindness of God. There was wonder in their eyes, not frantic astonishment, but the quiet awe that lingers after a gift too great for words. They did not shout. They did not clamor. They simply received, and were satisfied. The hillside itself seemed to sigh with them. The grass pressed flat where bodies reclined, the air heavy with the scent of bread and fish, the earth holding the echo of laughter and relief. Even creation seemed to rest in the presence of abundance. The disciples gathered near one another for a moment, their hearts full but restless in wonder. They had been the ones to carry the food. They had felt the weight of the baskets. They had seen with their own eyes that what had been little was now overflowing. Yet even as they watched, they struggled to take it in. Their reason could not contain it. Their faith strained to grasp it. Their souls knew it was holy, even if their minds could not explain it. And the people, thousands of them, breathed out peace together. A multitude made one by the miracle. They had come hungry. They would leave satisfied. But more than that, they would leave changed, carrying within them the memory of the evening when heaven bent low and filled them with more than they could ask or imagine. The hillside, once marked by longing, was now marked by fullness. And in the center of it all, Jesus, the bread of life Himself, the one who gives without end. When the last of the hunger had been quieted, and the crowd leaned back in peace, Jesus turned to his disciples with a gentle instruction. Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. The disciples moved slowly at first, unsure there would be anything to collect. For how could fragments remain when so many had eaten? And eaten until full. Yet obedience guided their steps. And so they began to walk among the multitude with their baskets, stooping to gather what had been left behind. To their astonishment, the baskets began to fill quickly. Bread that had been torn but not consumed. Fish that had been passed but not finished. Each fragment carried the same flavor of miracle. Each piece bore the same testimony of abundance. And the disciples' hands grew heavy with gathering. One by one, the baskets filled to the brim, until each of the 12 disciples stood with a vessel overflowing. More food stood in their arms than had been laid in the boy's satchel at the beginning. What had started with 5 loaves and 2 fish now ended with 12 baskets of leftovers. A visible sign that in the hands of Christ, there is always more than enough. The people watched with wonder, murmurs rising like soft waves as they saw the abundance carried past them. Some pointed to the baskets with wide eyes. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Children laughed, calling out to their parents about the food still being gathered. Elders wept quietly, remembering the wilderness stories of manna, and seeing before them the same God who had once fed their ancestors now feeding them. The disciples themselves trembled as they carried their baskets back toward Jesus. Each step a testimony. Each weight upon their shoulders a reminder that what they had doubted had now become undeniable. They had thought the food too little. They had thought the crowd too many. Yet here they stood with arms full of what remained. A surplus born not of scarcity stretched thin, but of love poured out without measure. The baskets stood as symbols, not only of provision, but of the nature of God's abundance. It does not merely meet the need. It surpasses it. It does not simply fill the emptiness. It overflows. It does not end with enough. It carries on into more than enough. As the 12 stood together with baskets brimming, the crowd looked on in silence, awed by what they beheld. The miracle was no longer invisible, no longer hidden in the breaking of bread and the passing of fish. It was now visible, tangible, undeniable. 12 baskets full of fragments that bore witness to the inexhaustible generosity of God. The disciples met one another's eyes. And though no words were spoken, the weight of the baskets said all that needed to be said. Each of them held in their arms a personal reminder that their doubts had been answered with abundance, that their limits had been met with God's limitless love. The hillside, once marked by hunger, was now covered in evidence of grace. The people satisfied. The disciples holding more than they had begun with. And Jesus at the center. Calm, steady, radiant in quiet authority. The sea mirrored the last traces of fading light. The stars gathered in greater numbers across the sky, and the night seemed to wrap the scene in reverence. Heaven had touched earth upon a grassy hillside, and it left behind baskets brimming with a reminder that in Him, nothing is wasted. Nothing is too small. Nothing is ever beyond His power to provide. And so the baskets stood as testimony, silent yet louder than words, that with God, there is always enough, and more than enough. The multitude settled into a stillness unlike any other. It was not the uneasy silence of hunger that had marked the late afternoon, nor the anxious quiet of waiting for the unknown. It was a silence born of fullness, of gratitude that had no words, of or that could only breathe softly in the presence of something holy. The people leaned back into the grass, their faces turned upward toward the stars that now embroidered the sky. Their stomachs were full, but more than that, their souls rested in peace. They had eaten until they wanted no more, and now they lingered in the afterglow of mercy. A father rested with his arm across his children, listening to their quiet laughter as they spoke of how the bread had seemed never to end. A mother held her little one close, rocking gently as the child's breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. An elder closed his eyes, the taste of fish still upon his tongue, tears slipping down his cheeks as he remembered wilderness wanderings long ago, when manna had fallen with the dawn. And now, here on this hillside, manna had come again. Voices rose occasionally in soft wonder, not loud, not clamoring, but reverent. A man whispered to his neighbor of how the disciples kept returning with baskets that never emptied. A woman marveled that her child, who had eaten so little at home, could not stop eating until her hunger was gone. Another simply sat in silence, shaking her head in disbelief, yet smiling all the same. The disciples too felt the hush, their arms still heavy from carrying baskets, their hearts heavier still with what they had witnessed. They did not chatter. They did not explain. They only looked toward their teacher with a mixture of reverence and trembling love. For they had seen him break the bread, and they had seen it multiply in their very hands. They had felt the weight of the miracle pressed against their palms. Jesus himself stood among them quietly, his presence gentle, steady, not demanding recognition, not seeking applause. The miracle was not meant for spectacle. It was meant for love. He had seen the need, and he had met it fully, abundantly, tenderly. And now he simply remained among them, the shepherd with his flock, the bread of life in the midst of those he had fed. The hillside, bathed in moonlight, seemed to hold its breath, as if creation itself bowed low before what had just taken place. The sea shimmered softly, its waves whispering like a psalm upon the shore. The grass beneath the multitude carried the fragrance of bread and fish, a sacred perfume that mingled with the cool night air. No one hurried to leave. No one wanted to break the stillness. They lingered in the holy quiet, hearts wrapped in the peace of being cared for. Not just their bodies, but their very souls. The miracle had fed them in ways they could not yet name. Gratitude lay thick across the hillside. Not shouted, not sung, but breathed. Each sigh, each whispered prayer, each tear shed quietly in the dark, was an offering of thanks. The people knew they had witnessed something eternal, something they would tell their children and their children's children. But in this moment, words were unnecessary, for the silence itself was worship. The disciples stood close together, and though their minds swirled with questions, their hearts were stilled by the hush that surrounded them. They realized that this quiet, this holy pause, was part of the miracle itself. For abundance does not always end in noise. Sometimes it ends in rest, in peace so deep that the soul has no need to speak. The night deepened, stars multiplying across the heavens, the crowd reclining as though upon a vast table set by God Himself. And in the center of it all, the quiet form of Jesus, calm, serene, the true bread that had come down from heaven. The hush of gratitude wrapped the multitude like a blanket, covering them in wonder, holding them in peace, leading them gently toward rest. The baskets stood as silent witnesses. Yet the true miracle reached deeper than loaves and fish. For even as the multitude rested in the fullness of their bodies, another hunger stirred quietly beneath. A hunger that bread alone could never satisfy. Jesus knew it. He always knew it. The ache of the human heart runs deeper than the stomach. It is the hunger for meaning, the longing for love that will not fade, the thirst for peace that cannot be taken away. And so while the crowd marveled at bread that multiplied, His eyes looked beyond, to the deeper truth they did not yet see. The people reclined upon the hillside, murmuring their gratitude. But within His heart, He longed for them to understand that the bread in their hands pointed to something greater, that the food filling their stomachs was a sign of a nourishment everlasting. The disciples too felt the mystery pressing close. Their arms had carried more than baskets that day. They had carried revelation. They had seen with their eyes what abundance looked like. And yet they sensed that even this was not the fullness of the gift. For the loaves and fish were temporary. Their satisfaction would fade with dawn. But the one who had given them remained. Jesus was not merely the provider of bread. He was the bread, the life that satisfies forever. He Himself was the gift, the sustenance, the source. And though he did not yet speak these words to the crowd, the miracle itself declared it. Every piece of bread broken proclaimed, "I am enough." Every fish multiplied whispered, "I am the sustenance of life." Every satisfied heart testified, "He is the one who fills." The people would wake the next day, and hunger would return, as it always does. The body requires food again and again. But the deeper hunger, the one that gnaws at the edges of the soul, finds its rest only in him. The hillside glowed faintly beneath the rising moon, and the multitude lay scattered across it like seeds upon the earth. Seeds of faith waiting to grow. For though many did not yet understand, the memory of this evening would take root in their hearts. Some would remember the taste of the bread, others the sound of laughter, but all would remember the one at the center of it all. The disciples, though still learning, would recall this moment in years to come, when they too would break bread in his name, when they too would feed not only bodies but souls. They did not yet see the cross before them, nor the table of remembrance, nor the Spirit who would one day fill them with fire. But this night, this miracle, was planting in them the truth they would one day proclaim. Jesus stood quietly, his face lit by both moonlight and the gentle awe of those around him. He knew the bread they had eaten would fade. He knew their bodies would hunger again. But he also knew that the true bread had been given in himself, and that those who would come to him would never hunger, and those who believed in him would never thirst. The deeper meaning pulsed beneath the surface of the night, unseen by many, but alive nonetheless. The bread of life had revealed himself, not only in word, but in deed. And so the hillside became more than a place of feeding. It became a signpost, pointing beyond the moment to eternity. The people slept satisfied, but Jesus remained watchful, his heart steady in the knowledge that what had begun with loaves and fish would one day be fulfilled in his own body broken, his own life given, his own love poured out without end. Trust. It is the thread that binds the miracle together. The boy trusted enough to give what was in his hands. The disciples, though uncertain, trusted enough to carry baskets that should have emptied. The crowd, though weary, trusted enough to remain seated until the day was far spent. And above all, Jesus trusted the Father completely, lifting what was small with thanksgiving, knowing it would become more than enough. This trust was not fragile. It was not born of chance. It was rooted in the heart of God's faithfulness across time. The same God who had sent manna from heaven in the wilderness, who had poured water from the rock for his people, who had kept his covenant from generation to generation, was the same God now multiplying bread on the hillside of Galilee. The people may not have seen the full story, But the rhythm was there. Always the same. Human hunger meets divine provision. Human emptiness meets heavenly fullness. And at the center, trust bridges the gap. Trust is not always easy. The disciples knew this well. They had worried over the crowd, measured the cost, named the impossibility. They had felt the tension between responsibility and helplessness. And yet when they placed the loaves and fish in Jesus' hands, trust had begun to grow. Fragile at first, but strengthened with every step back and forth through the crowd. Each return to him met with more than they had carried away. So it is with the soul. Each time we bring our lack to him, each time we return with open hands, we find that what he gives is more than what we had before. Our trust grows not in theory, but in practice. In the lived rhythm of bringing what is small and watching him make it enough. The crowd too had trusted without even naming it. They had remained when hunger gnawed at their bodies. They had stayed when the day grew long. Their presence itself was a quiet act of faith. They had chosen to remain near him, believing in some unspoken way that he would not send them away empty. And he had not. He never does. This trust is not bound to a single hillside or a single evening. It flows into every corner of life, into every season of need, into the days when work feels scarce, into the nights when loneliness presses heavy, into the seasons when strength wanes and the heart feels weak, into the hours when hope flickers like a candle in the wind. Trust does not deny the hunger. It does not pretend the need is not real. It simply places the need in his hands and waits, knowing that the same love which multiplied bread for thousands will not fail to provide for one. The disciples would remember this night when storms raged upon the sea, when their purses grew light upon the road, when crowds pressed them with needs they could not meet. They would remember that what was once too little became more than enough when surrendered to him, and their trust would steady them in the days to come. For trust is not a fleeting moment. It is the steady rhythm of leaning upon God, again and again, knowing he does not fail. The hillside grew quiet as the multitude settled into rest. But within their hearts, the memory of trust remained, not only in what they had received, but in the one from whom it had come. The sea whispered its steady hymn against the shore. The stars stretched across the heavens, and trust lingered like fragrance upon the night. A trust that would be carried forward into tomorrow, into every tomorrow. For the bread of life had shown them that no hunger is too small, no need too great, no soul too hidden to be met by his love. The night upon the hillside carried echoes of an older story, a story the people of Israel had carried in their bones for generations, of wandering through desert sands, of tents pitched beneath endless skies, of waking to find manna spread like dew across the ground. In the wilderness their ancestors had hungered, and God had fed them. Not once, not twice, but daily. Bread from heaven, white like coriander seed, tasting faintly of honey, appearing each dawn like a promise renewed. It had been enough to sustain them through 40 years. Enough to remind them that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And now here, on a Galilean hillside, another multitude had hungered, and God had fed them once more. Not with manna falling from the sky, but with bread multiplied in the hands of his Son. The same faithfulness, the same love, the same abundance. The elders among the crowd would have remembered those ancient stories. Some perhaps had spoken of them on the journey, reminding their children of the God who had never forsaken his people. Now their eyes filled with tears as they realized the stories were alive again. Not distant legend, but present reality. The God of their fathers was here, feeding them still. The disciples too must have felt the weight of history pressing close. For had they not grown up hearing the tales of manna and quail, of water from the rock, of provision in barren places? And now they themselves carried baskets heavy with fragments. Tangible proof that the God of Moses was the same God walking among them in the flesh. The wilderness had taught their ancestors dependence. Each morning they gathered what they needed, never storing beyond the day, never hoarding in fear, always trusting that tomorrow would bring more. The hillside had now taught the same. The people had come with nothing, and they had left satisfied, not because of what they carried, but because of who had fed them. The sea whispered against the shore like the desert winds of old. The grass beneath them became like the wilderness floor. The bread in their hands like manna renewed. Everything in creation seemed to testify. The Lord has not changed. His love endures. His provision remains. Oi! And yet, this night pointed beyond even manna. For the bread their ancestors ate could not keep them from death. It sustained for a season, but not forever. This bread, broken and multiplied by Jesus, pointed to the bread of life himself, who would give not only for a day, but for eternity. The abundance in the wilderness had prepared the way for this abundance on the hillside. And the abundance on the hillside was preparing the way for an abundance greater still, when his own body would be broken, his own life given, that all who partook of him might live forever. The connection was clear to those with eyes to see. God had always been the provider, always the one who feeds his people in barren places, always the one who turns emptiness into fullness. scarcity into sufficiency, wilderness into home. As the people settled into rest, some whispered to their children of the manna long ago, and told them that tonight was like that, but greater. For the one who had fed their ancestors through the wilderness was the very one who had sat among them on the hillside, teaching, blessing, breaking, giving. The continuity stretched like an unbroken thread from desert sands to grassy slopes, from tents in the wilderness to a multitude beneath the stars. And the thread would continue still further, to a cross, to an empty tomb, to the ends of the earth. The God who had been faithful in the wilderness had been faithful by the sea, and would remain faithful through all generations. The night deepened, but the story of abundance did not end. It stretched onward, eternal, carrying with it the assurance that wherever God's people walk, whether through desert or meadow, whether in famine or in feast, His provision will always be enough. Trust had been written across the hillside that night, not only in the bread that filled empty hands, not only in the fish that satisfied weary stomachs, but in the very presence of the one who gave. His abundance was not only for the crowd long ago. It flows even now into the lives of all who rest in Him. The baskets of leftovers still stood as silent testimony, but the greater invitation lay in the heart. An invitation to believe that God's love is not measured in fragments, not portioned with reluctance, but poured out in fullness, again and again. To trust Him is to release the clenched hands that grasp too tightly at what little we hold. To trust Him is to place our loaves and fish, however small, into His keeping, believing that nothing surrendered to Him remains small. It becomes what we cannot imagine. Sufficient for today, sufficient for tomorrow, sufficient for eternity. The crowd had trusted without even realizing it. They had stayed when hunger pressed them. They had waited when reason might have sent them away. And their waiting was met with abundance. How often is our own waiting the same? Our souls ache for answers. Our hearts hunger for peace. And we are tempted to leave the hillside, to seek provision in our own way. Yet if we remain, if we rest in His presence, we find that He does not let us go empty. The disciples too learned trust anew. They had doubted. They had reasoned with numbers and impossibilities. But in carrying basket after basket that never ran dry, their trust grew. They came to see that faith is not the absence of questions, but the willingness to place questions into His hands and keep walking back to Him for more. And so tonight, the same invitation is extended. Trust the one who sees your hunger. Trust the one who knows your need before you speak it. Trust the one whose hands never empty, whose love never lessens, whose provision never fails. Whatever you carry, whatever feels too small, whatever feels not enough, place it into his keeping. For in his hands, insufficiency becomes abundance. Weakness becomes strength. Despair becomes hope. Let your breathing slow now. In and out. Like the tide against the shore that framed that ancient hillside. With each breath, release what you cling to. With each exhale, let go of scarcity. With each inhale, receive the abundance of his love. The night grows deeper. Stars spread across the sky like countless grains of bread. Unending, unmeasured, reminding us that his mercy is without limit, his faithfulness without end. Trust does not mean you will never hunger again. It means that when hunger comes, you know where to turn. It means that in every emptiness, you remember the hands that multiplied loaves and fish. The hands that still bless. The hands that still give. The hands that once stretched wide upon a cross to feed the whole world with love that cannot die. Rest in that trust tonight. Let it hold you as the hillside held the multitude. Let it quiet you as the bread quieted their hunger. Let it cover you as the stars covered the evening sky. You are not forgotten. You are not unseen. You are beloved. You are fed. The hillside lay quiet beneath the vast canopy of stars. The multitude, once restless with hunger, now rested in peace. Their bodies satisfied. Their hearts calmed. Their souls wrapped in a silence that could only be born of abundance. The night air was cool, the sea steady in its rhythm, the earth itself at ease. Jesus remained at the center of it all. Not seeking attention. Not demanding recognition. But simply present. Like a shepherd among his flock. His gaze tender. His presence steady. His love unbroken. The miracle had ended, yet its meaning lingered. Woven into the fabric of every life touched that evening. Families drifted into slumber upon the grass. Children curled close to their parents. Elders reclining in comfort they had not expected when the day began. The disciples too rested, their baskets now set aside. Their minds still turning over what they had seen. Their hearts heavy with awe. Their doubts had been answered. Their fears eased. Their faith stretched wider than they knew it could reach. The sea whispered on, lapping against the shore as though singing a lullaby written before time. The stars multiplied overhead, each one shining as a reminder of promises kept, of faithfulness without end. The night wrapped the hillside like a soft blanket, enfolding the crowd in peace. The memory of this day would follow them, carried back into their villages, spoken of at firesides and shared at tables. Children would tell of bread that never ran out. Mothers would recall the joy of their little ones eating until full. Fathers would recount the awe in the disciples' eyes. Elders would whisper of manna and wilderness made new. And in every telling, hearts would remember not just the bread, but the one who gave it. For the true gift was not the loaves, not the fish, not even the 12 baskets of leftovers. The true gift was Jesus himself, the bread of life come down from heaven, the one who gives not only for a moment, but forever, the one who fills not only the stomach, but the soul, the one who satisfies hunger so deep it cannot be named. And tonight, that same gift is offered still. The same peace, the same abundance, the same presence that fed the multitude now rests near you. Gently, quietly, faithfully. So let your heart release its burdens. Let your soul loosen its grip on worry. Let your body sink into stillness. As the multitude once reclined upon the hillside, you too may rest in his provision. You too may trust his hands to hold you. You too may find peace in the knowledge that he is enough. The night deepens, yet there is no fear in it. Only calm, only rest. For the bread of life has come near, and in him there is no lack, no emptiness, no end to mercy. Close your eyes now. Breathe in the peace he gives. Breathe out the weight of the day. Let the hush of gratitude settle over you. Let the stillness of his love guide you gently into sleep. For the story is not finished. It continues with you, carried into your dreams, into your tomorrows, into every place you walk. The one who fed the multitude is the one who walks beside you still. Rest now, beloved. Rest in his abundance. Rest in his love. Rest in the bread of life who is and always will be enough.